gentlemen, thanks again for coming out today, this weekend. And this is an important session, and we are glad that you could join us. I'll quickly do introductions, and then we will go ahead and have a conversation. We'll have, in fact, brief statements from our panelists, after which we'll open the floor. We want it to be conversational, so do join in as much as you can and bring along your questions. My name is Benjamin Tetteh, and I'm a journalist, also a PhD student in communication at Syracuse University. And I thank the organizers for this opportunity. Thank you. For our panel today, I'll start with us here first. And we have a name which is pretty very much common. In fact, people will walk in this morning. I was at the reception, and people walk in and they're like, when I mentioned Syracuse, I was like, oh, did you come with this professor? I say, yes, of course, I came with him. And his name is Professor Horace Campbell. About 5-6 years ago, before even Syracuse University, I got to meet him in Senegal when he was visiting one of the research for Israel. And Professor Campbell is a chair for GPAM North Africa. He was chair of the African American African Studies Department at Syracuse University. He has held different positions. So thank you so much for joining us today. We also have James Mealy, who is former Assistant Secretary of Education and Public Service, Smithsonian. Thank you for joining us as well. We have others who will join us online. We have Marc, who is Vice President for the Asian Business Council. We also have Usamuddin, who is with the old Omdurman RC member from Sudan. And if you follow Sudan news, this is the group that has been doing so much. We will start actually with a video recording from Sanusha Naidu, who is with the Institute for Global Dialogue, South Africa. And for this session, we are looking on specific topics from trade, Sudan, Ukraine war, Global Fragility Act, US strategy of Africa, China-Russia counter policies, and discriminatory visa practice. I guess each of these topics can stand on their own. So it is going to be a very interesting conversation. Let's join Sanusha Naidu for the video recording.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say how grateful I am to be here addressing you via this taped video address based on what I think is going to be a fantastic, if not already, most timely discussion on the way the global dynamics and the role of the US in global affairs involvement. I have to say a big thank you to Horace Campbell for roping in and asking me to basically provide this 10-minute presentation on my thoughts and reflecting on my thoughts on what I feel are key critical issues in the context of Africa in the upcoming US-Africa Summit. I think the global people's intervention, holds very close to my heart, given the fact that I played a critical role when I worked with the Social Justice Network of Bahama, where we organized similar issues around trying to provide the alternate voice, the alternate space, and the alternate engagement, and where Prof. Campbell played a critical role and a very, very active role with colleagues of Bahama, as well as with myself. And I feel really, really privileged to be back in his ambit at his radar and to be providing these views that he's asked me to do so. I think the challenge for us today is to understand where we are as a global community, the humanity, and most importantly, I think the challenge is to understand what does these different emerging, re-emerging, evolving, recalibrating relationships that Africa has with partners, with the former colonial powers, or actors that just are re-emerging in the African continent. What does that mean? What is the architecture? What is the construct? And reflecting on this summit that's coming and looking at the concept and the discussions that define this intervention or this Congress today that you're hosting, I think it's very key to ask the very pertinent question, and that is, are we still sitting in a VUCA world? A VUCA world characterized by vulnerability, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I think we've reached a point where we have moved beyond that conceptualization of risk and of the way the international system and the international engagements have been defined and characterized. We are now sitting in a world that's caught between the VUCAs of the way we want to interpret this world, and a world that's brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible to upon you. And a world that essentially is becoming increasingly toxic because of the way in which global affairs and the relationship that we see under geostrategic interest have redefined the relationship that we in Africa have with the rest of the world. But more importantly, the relationship that essentially has made the multilateral system brittle as opposed to deepening the multilateral context. Based on these kind of opening remarks of mine, I think what's really important for us to understand is that when we're looking at the summit that African leaders are invited to by President Biden, it's becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, and of course, increasingly anxious for us in Africa, particularly academic scholarship, civil society, and the broader context of the think tank community, which I represent. And forgive me, I had introduced myself, I'm Naidu from the Institute for Global Dialogue based in South Africa, but out of Cape Town. We're beginning to think that this is becoming a much more deeper, unrooted world order. It's no longer the kind of engagements that define around the flexibility or the
it looks like the video truncated, but that said, we'll continue with the conversation. We have, okay, we'll continue, and then we'll come with our panelists here as we wait for those. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we good to go to Mealy?
Yeah.
Okay. In the meantime, let's acknowledge all those who have joined us on Zoom and those who are watching across the various platforms. We really acknowledge. I can see nearly 40 participants on Zoom, 39. And we are very glad that it's weekend, it's also cold, and people made it right here to join us. It's no mean effort, and it shows our collective interest, which is that the passion of Pan-Africanism on our hearts. And thank you all for participating.
Marc, you can go.
Okay, so we will go to take Mealy now, and we'll come back to our panelists here.
Okay, thank you. Hope everyone can hear and see me okay.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. First, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I think it's very valuable for African peoples around the world to hear alternative perspectives to the rhetoric, which I'm sure will be promoted at the upcoming US-Africa Leaders Summit about the past, present, and future of America's economic relations with African nations. My comments, I want to use some examples from my past 20 years of experience in working with nations in Southeast Asia, countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, to share some comments on what I believe are some strategic considerations which citizens of African nations and of course African peoples around the world should implore the African heads of state, whether they listen or not is to be debated, that they should take into account in terms of the international economic relations with the United States, particularly given the current trends, which are kind of shaping where the global economy is going. I come at this work when I started as a young economist back in the late 1980s. I actually worked in the US government and I actually did work on Africa. And during those years, not only did I learn a lot, but I brought a lot because I was really a student of people like Walter Rodney and Samir Amin and Yash Tandon, as well as, of course, the quote unquote neoclassical economists. And very early in my career, I really saw firsthand how my employer, and we were talking like in the 1990s, was actively helping to perpetuate white minority control over land in Zimbabwe. And of course, that's actually probably one of the main reasons why I ended up leaving working for the US government, because it really was inconsistent with my values and what I thought was what should be done and going forward. And also in the 1990s did a lot of work with various countries throughout South Africa and East Africa, as well as West Africa. And thus when the AGOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act, was signed by Clinton in 2000, I really had an opportunity to offer a number of analyses as to how I thought AGOA was probably not going to live up to the hype, as they say. First and foremost, has been managed by a few of our previous panelists. AGOA was celebrated as going to be like a game changer. But of course, if you looked at it very closely, it was rooted in many of the false assumptions, like African nations are poor in the world today because somehow they're left out of the global economy. And somehow AGOA was going to fix that. And of course, many of the underlying principles or preconditions for AGOA were, of course, the same identical, same old neoliberal structural adjustment-based policies from the IMF and World Bank, which of course we all know never supported processes of sustainable socioeconomic development to help former colonized countries really transform those colonial economic models to have economies that could really serve their interests of the societies in the 21st century. In my second publication during that time, I actually raised two, I think, basic questions about looking backwards at AGOA, which I think should inform us as we think about this summit. The first question was, if trade is going to support sustainable, inclusive processes of development and really help countries to sort of transform those economic models, AGOA, quote unquote, can't just increase levels of trade, i.e. the quantity of what is traded. It also would have to play a role in helping to change the qualitative nature of trade, i.e. what Africa trades. And so my basic question was, will AGOA help change both the quantity and quality of trade between African nations and the United States? And of course, the second point I teed up was, African societies can use trade and investment, can use them if they represent net positive resource transfers into those societies. And then those resources can be used to finance really the development of those societies. And I raised the question back then, 20 some odd years ago, will AGOA help reverse US-Africa trade, investment, and other resource net outflows? As we look to the summit coming up next week, where obviously the USG has said it wants to update AGOA, and even the US Chamber of Commerce says they plan to promote deals between American companies and African companies. I think African peoples can look at the data to help answer the questions that I posed really 20 plus years ago about AGOA. In short, my own research tells me, while the quantity of US-Africa two-way trade went up from, let's say, 2001 to 2011, because it's actually been declining since 2011, but with very few exceptions. The quality of generally what is traded pretty much has remained the same. There's been no shift. We know Africa exports raw materials, oil, et cetera, minerals. Now we got into a little bit of textiles, and the US exports manufactured products, equipment, chemicals, and machines. What's actually kind of ironic in the midst of that broad trend, in recent years, US exports of oil and gas to Africa, to African nations, has actually become a bigger share of what US is actually sending to the continent. And believe it or not, Africa's exports of oil and gas to the United States are actually right now on a downward trend. So just those trade numbers, I think, tell us AGOA hasn't really done much to change the nature of US trade with the continent. And more importantly, as I think several panelists have already noted, AGOA definitely has not done anything to basically stop the way that most African economies are still net exports of resources, particularly capital, leaving the continent, going out to the world. So this history matters, because I think as we look at the summit is occurring during a period of sort of changing dynamics in the global economy, which I would think has been best summarized as we're in a period of the sort of the growing weaponization of international economics. Now, for some countries and for some societies, these changes are not necessarily going to generate change for them. And in fact, I would put on the table that for some parts of the world, and we may consider Africa being part of this question, while things are changing globally, Africa's position in the global system is actually being reinforced, or the attempts are to reinforce it. But for others in the global system, which I would say including some certain countries in Asia, including countries that were former colonies, we are now seeing alternative regional economic frameworks, and perhaps more importantly, institutions that are not necessarily radical or progressive. I might say maybe they're more nationalistic, but alternatives nonetheless being developed in Asia, led by Asian governments themselves. And there's a number of things in terms of trade, like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, things like the Digital Economic Partnership, DEPA, the Chiang Mai Initiative, which was launched almost 30 years ago, which has now been multilateralized, which is sort of a financial resource. So the countries in Asia no longer have to depend upon the IMF if they run into a macroeconomic crisis. And two very important institutions have been launched in Asia, which I think are changing the nature of who really has influence over governments. One is the Economic Research Institute for Asia, ERIA, and another group called the AMRO, which actually is playing the role that the IMF used to play in terms of sort of monitoring the macroeconomic situations of country in Asia. So in a sense, these new institutions, new framework, have actually generated some degrees of structural change in certain societies, again, within the system. And I would also argue that because Asians have created some of these alternative frameworks and institutions in Asia, when 9 of the 10 Southeast Asian leaders came to Washington in May as the ASEAN region to attend the US ASEAN Special Summit, they actually came to the White House with greater degrees of some freedom and flexibility, and even made some demands in response to some of the USG's new economic proposal initiatives. So let me just turn quickly to a couple of examples, which I think are very telling. You know, I first got drawn into the work around Southeast Asia, particularly like the country like Malaysia, not only because they had governments that one time said no to sort of adopting IMF, World Bank structural adjustment programs, or even saying no to Western financial credit card companies who wanted them not to limit the number of credit cards their citizens, including their students, could have, but because as a multiracial and multi-religious nation that at the time of their political independence had a colonial structured economy which produced tin, rubber, and palm oil for the export. But you flash forward today, in a structurally sort of transformed economy, now manufactures cars, rubber gloves, semiconductor chips, and laptops that are consumed by Malaysian citizens, Asians in the region, and of course, the whole world. I would also look at example, say, of Vietnam, which I'm not sure if any developing nation in the last 20 years has done as much to achieve certain degrees of structural transforming their economy as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. From an economy that in the 1990s and early 2000s, that was part of the global system primarily as a producer of coffee, rice, tea, and cashews, to now being part of the global system, but also producing cell phones, semiconductor chips, and renewable wind energy turbines, particularly by the significant investments they've made in STEM-oriented higher education and training. Again, while quantity of trade is certainly not a key for any society in terms of promoting real development, it should be noted that in 2000, the same year that AGOA was quote unquote coming together in Congress. The United States and Vietnam signed a bilateral trade deal. And today, Vietnam is now America's fourth largest trading partner in the world, with over $100 billion in two-way trade flows last year in 2021. And I compare that to two-way trade flows between the United States and the entire continent of Africa, roughly at $64 billion in two-way trade. So I think that, again, should be something that we want people to sort of have those kind of contextual historical knowledge. And then lastly, a very recent example, the nation of Indonesia, which like many former colonies had its economy structured primarily again to produce raw materials in the case of the mining industry, where they were mining iron ore and bauxite, copper, tin, nickel, primarily for export. In the last 5 years, the elites, and again, I would say these are not progressive or radical elites in Indonesia, they've basically said, we want our government to not follow neoliberal economic policies and actually adopt policies over the opposition of the World Bank, the IMF, major US economies and Europe, to basically put in place export bans on raw materials. And in doing those export bans on raw materials, basically saying we're no longer just going to ship our iron ore and our nickel and our tin out to the world where it gets processed, where it becomes more valuable and then sent back to us. In partnership with doing other things around promoting local ecosystems for industry development, they're now using their tin and nickel to basically manufacture EV battery components and other types of manufacturing types of products, creating jobs for their Indonesians. In closing, so when we obviously are discussing the context of, when African leaders are going to come to the summit, I think it's critical that African citizens, as well as in a diaspora, urge, again, whether they listen or not remains to be seen, the following. Number one, understand that as we talk about maybe updating AGOA, the current geopolitical economic strategies of the United States and Europe and other countries to sort of, in this competition with China, are well underway, first in technology, but also going to be in many other sectors. And it should be noted that even non-progressive analysts have said that with these strategies that are being pursued and these investments being made, they really don't include societies on the continent of Africa, yet alone even primarily, Black or brown communities here in America. Secondly, more progressive analysis would even challenge that notion by saying, actually, no, the economies on the continent of Africa are probably included in some of these new geopolitical strategies. But of course, they're probably being included in the same ways they've always been included, which is as a source of raw materials at the bottom of high technology and other strategic industry global value chains. Third, elites in some of the Asian societies that I mentioned are increasingly using their states to try to better navigate this current period of, again, the increased weaponization of international economics. And here are some of the things that I've been able to see firsthand in working with some of these governments around Asia. Number one, rejecting the pressure of sort of the zero-sum picking sides, between I'm either for America or for China or whatever. Basically, it goes back to the old sort of non-aligned position. And we saw that very clearly with Indonesia when they hosted the G20 summit, where they basically refused a lot of pressure to somehow not invite Russia and invite Ukraine to come to the summit. They basically said, no, we're not going to do that. Secondly, we're seeing these states really hedge against both the major powers that are basically in this rivalry and competition. I call it playing a bit chess as opposed to checkers, particularly because what they're able to see is that the domestic situations in many of the geopolitical powers, United States to Europe, they're causing elites in a number of countries in Asia to say, you know what, it really wouldn't be in our interest to base our future prosperity and success on these countries when we're not even sure where these countries are really going. And we know that because there's a lot of fear that we may have a Trump 2.0 elected into our government in 2024. And so they're seeing that and they're hedging. Two, and I should say three, investing in building their own alternative frameworks and institutions, as I noted. In a sense, I see this as really as creating new tables as opposed to just always trying to get onto someone else's table. And here's the thing, it's very important, I think, to consider. In some of the ways, some of the new tables that Asian countries are creating in Asia are actually beginning to also influence things going on globally. Because as we all know, there's still this geopolitical rivalry going on, but it's not just simply a zero-sum kind of dynamic. There's actually some alternatives that all the major powers now have to take into account within their strategy. Fourthly, I'm hearing from elites in many countries are saying, you know what, we should not be looking for leadership from either China or the United States to help their societies figure out how to navigate how the world is changing. I think that might be a very valuable lesson for African heads of state to keep in mind. And then lastly, understanding that as the European elites are choosing really to sacrifice their own economies. Again, these are, as you know, many of the former colonizers of Africa that are basically choosing almost to de-industrialize themselves in order to be aligned with the United States vis-a-vis the Russia and Ukraine war. It's pretty clear that governments and elites in Asia are saying, yeah, we can't make that choice because, yeah, we're the former colonized countries. We don't have the benefit of having accumulated hundreds of years of wealth by being former colonizers. And I think that should also send a signal to where African citizens should be trying to tell their governments where they should be prioritizing future international economic partnerships. I'll stop there, thank you.
Very well said. Thank you, Marc Mealy, Senior Vice President, Policy at the U.S. Asian Business or Asian Business Council. I guess we'll come to the table here now and bring the conversation home. We're still hoping that we'll have a guest joining us on Zoom once we have a green light. But now let me turn to my right to Mr. James Tetteh, who's former Secretary of Education and Public Service. Sonia, the mic is yours.
Thank you. I know I should have positioned myself on the left. I had not intended to be here today, nor to be on the Zoom. But when Professor Horace Campbell, that's one dimension in which I know him, but I know him more as an applied, progressive, transformative person who is also a scholar when he calls it hard to resist. He had asked that I make comments on what might be said to African leaders about reparatory justice here in the United States, of which I'm not really going to talk about. I don't come with a prepared presentation, but I am going to give some comments based on what I've heard this morning. I'm so pleased that he did leverage me to, he said, just go on Zoom. I said, no, now that you came to me, I'm going to come and be present. I'm so glad that I've come to be present. I'm almost 76 years old. I'm a former graduate student here, a dropout PhD program in history at Howard University. Former president of the Graduate Student Association here at Howard at a time when Leon Kandran Damas, who was a socialist, one of the three principal founders of Naidu, was here. I'm mindful that Capitalism and Slavery was written right here at Howard University. C.L.R. James, the socialist, perhaps the most important Marxist in the 20th century in this hemisphere, worked here at Howard University. I'm giving some autobiographical things because I'm mindful that I'm at a university where there are young minds in formation. I'm also mindful in the breaks that I'm meeting young adults who are working in a multiplicity of organizations, not just left-wing organizations. I'm a product of the new communist movement. That was not a banner that I wore on my shirt, but my voice was always here. 5 years on WHUR when it was 360 degrees of blackness on a program called 10 Minutes Left, where we looked at issues of socialism, communism. Why am I saying this? Because we live in a world of 8 billion people. It's a complex situation. we talk about nature, but we separate ourselves out from nature, but the cockroach has been around and will be around longer than we have. We are part of that. There are many complexities that we have to negotiate. We have to earn a living. We inhabit many places and having to earn that living. I've known Marc Mealy since he was a preteen. I'm so proud, and I know his family background, the radicalness of that. What I'm suggesting, and I'm really speaking to the younger adults here, that we do not lack for data. We do not lack for analysis. We often tend towards the logical, these sweeping generalizations, capitalism, socialism, being African with 53 countries, with probably about 6,000 languages, more languages than any, I think it's more languages than any continent on the world. What are these abstractions? So the logical must be intersected by the historical. What has actually happened? And what is actually happening now that becomes the historical? These are very important analytical tools, whether you're a student or whether you're working in a centrist organization, or whether you're on a left-wing trade union or a socialist organization. There are a lot of navigations to be done. And so we have to be very careful about our language. And so I'm really concerned about what is to be done, not in abstractions, but what is to be done by starting with the kind of analysis that many people have given here this morning, including Marc Mealy, of what is actually being done. So in the context of the United States, which is still the dominant, life-defining nation on the world by way of its neoliberal paradigm capitalist system, and the impositions of its media capacity, its cultural perspectives, and its economic warfare. The sanctions are economic warfare. It's another means of war, and it is against working people, the most impoverished, the most marginalized, the most needy people in a society. Yes, it does hit elites. You know, they say we have sanctioned Minister so-and-so and President X and the wife of General Y and so. But who is really suffering from this? It is the ordinary, everyday people that Julian Walker has described, where women are really the business backbone of not only Africa, but many developing countries. So how do we engage this? I want to talk about there are a number of battlefronts. Yes, we engage it by trade unions, by left-wing parties, by social movements, but we have to engage it where everyday people are. And from the vantage point of the US positionality on the globe and the role that we as citizens here, either willingly or inadvertently, or undecidedly because we want to keep our job, we have to find that latitude. And I want to talk about one of the battlefronts that many of us want to avoid, and that is the electoral battlefront. We're talking about a question of governance power, not some abstract notion of power. It's about governance power. What will be the policy, the values and the actual policies and programs and the allocations of budgets and expertise in collaboration with organized citizens that improve the material circumstances of our lives, give us security, and give us a proactive citizen responsibility in becoming leadership, not just becoming the citizens under the servants or the stewards of governance, but becoming stewards ourselves in relationship to the positionality of the United States with the rest of the world. If we want to engage Africa, we have to engage it in all of its diversity, all of its complications, and principally, I would urge, around organized citizens movements, be they women's movements, be they small collectives, be they left-wing parties, not just the heads of government. And we have to be very select about government heads. Look at the debacle that is South Africa in its governance structure today, and what that has redounded to working people who are in worse situation in South Africa today than they were under white supremacy apartheid. We cannot avoid those kinds of things simply by speaking to African leaders. We have to become the leaders. And I say that to you young adults who are working in some of these mainstream organizations. You have to find the latitude, you have to stretch. The idea is not to put out abstract principles and be without a job, but it is to extract as much as you can in a progressive, from a progressive perspective, by integrating with these other sectors and by electing stewards of governance that you can hold accountable. If you look at the United States of America, 300 and some odd million people, what is the one ritual that most of the citizens, no matter what their ideological or political perspectives are, what is the one perennial ritual that they are involved in? Trying to elect stewards of governance. And they tend then to personify politics and personality. I got a Black woman. I got a preacher in Georgia. That is not politics. That is personality. That is not to deny what may be the goodness of the individual, but what is the role of the organized citizen, and having people in power and who are the stewards of governance, who will then work in collaboration with the most progressive citizens organizations in Africa and with select leaders and governments, which will help to advance this. Now, some people will say, well, you're just holding up the Democratic Party, or you're just holding up the Black Caucus and whatnot. I spent a lot of time in Cuba over the last 46 years, a lot of time in Cuba, not only with Cuban citizens, with the Cuban Communist Party, with the Cuban president. And I did this in my professional work. I wasn't hiding it, but not was I running around shouting, but I had to find my way. I'm urging you, you have to find your way to do this. Why was Diaz-Canals in Turkey last week? Turkey is a very complicated issue. Our brother from Libya will tell you that in this multipolarity that's evolving, you make hard decisions and hard compromises. He was in Russia. Russia has started a war with Ukraine. Who is dying? Ordinary Russian working class soldiers, ordinary working class Ukrainian soldiers, but Russia is a friend of Cuba. China is the largest trading partner in Latin America. The largest African descendant population outside of Nigeria lives where? In Brazil. Self-identified in the national census as 54% self-identified Black and mixed race. The relationship between the Workers' Party, and I've spent time with Lula da Silva. I went and spent time with him just a few months before he was in prison. Went to see him when he was in prison, although I was unable to go in that day because they only let 2 people in. Met him 20 years earlier in talking about the Black movement. Very important democratic socialist leader who relates to Africa. But with regard to China, that relationship of allowing, facilitating Brazil to become more sovereign, independent, and self-determined, that's not the end game. The ultimate evaluation optic is what redounds to working people, and when we talk about working people, you know, in the Marxist arena, which I come out of, we talk about class as though class doesn't have a sociology. There are women. Lula says that the face of poverty in Brazil is a woman, and she's Black. You see the intersections? We can't juxtapose trade unions against women's movements, against LGBTQ movements. We have to draw a horizontal line of who are the working and marginalized people in all of those sectors. We need to be more accurate with our descriptions of the complexities of what's going on in the world. And for us, and I will start to close this down, for us here in the United States, Africa is not only important because we have a cultural legacy with Africa, or because we are Black-skinned people. W. Du Bois had it right in 1903 when he said, the major question of the 20th century is the question of the color line. In 1953, 50 years after he wrote it, and he was asked if he would rewrite it, he said no, but he wrote a new preface. Go up on Monthly Review online and look at this preface. It's a very short, about 2 pages. And the third thing that he says is that I still believe today is yesterday, that the color line is a major question. And I've come to understand that there's something behind it that both motivates it, puts it into play, and obscures it at the same time. That a few people, a class of people, corporate, greedy, capitalist people, are willing to live in luxury at the great expense of the great majority of humankind living in misery, lack of access to education and wealth. And that in order to preserve this social relationship between capital and laboring people, they're willing to go to war, and this is the kicker, generally against people of color. Well, then you hearken back to 1903 when he wrote The Souls of Black Folk. Look at that preface. He wasn't just talking about the poor and immiserated Black people behind the veil here in the United States. He says explicitly, I'm talking about all of the people of the Asiatic Sea. You heard what Marc Mealy just said? All of those Asian countries that were colonized. He was talking about the racialized nature of capitalism. So this uplifts then African Americans in particular, of whatever our variety, whether we are Caribbean background, Afro-Brazilian background, whether we're Santeria practitioners or Catholics or atheists, we are here in the United States of America as citizens, as residents, as the immigrant population, and it puts us in a special position of taking responsibility to have people in governance who will respond to these ethical questions, not petitioning African leaders. Africans can very well do that themselves, but being the leadership of the transformative leadership that is needed in this country. And it will take a tremendous amount of commitment on your part. And I'm going to be somewhat ageist here. You young 20, 30, 40, 50-year-olds, those of you who are finding your way into the marketplace, who want to, like Marc Mealy is a great example, coming from a youngster who, and as he said, there's structural flexibility within the system. We have to take advantage of that. Everything is not a revolutionary moment. Revolutions come from a lot of work, in which then at some point there is a shift. So we have a special responsibility as African Americans to call out Austin, head of the Pentagon, a true violent imperialist position. He may be a nice guy to sit around and play checkers with, or shoot basketball, or shoot the breeze with, but he is running the US imperial military. Greenfield may be a nice sister, but she's there at the UN talking about give all this money. And yes, there are fascists in Ukraine. That's what John McCain and all those people were there. Yes, there are national minority questions in Ukraine of people who were never fully incorporated into that nation. And no, that does not mean that you are a handmaiden to Putin. Life is very complex. So we have to wind our way through what is actually going on to figure out what is to be done. And finally, we have a Indo-Caribbean African vice president with a Marxist father. How many of you know Professor Josh Myers? Any students out here in this audience? Josh Myers has written just the first definitive biography on the father of Black Marxism. Her father was in that study group. This is a complex situation in which abstractions and ideological formations don't answer it. And yes, you will have to make compromises. You will have to figure out when to bite your tongue to save your mouth, but when to open your mouth to save your body. You follow what I'm saying? It's not so simple as to have an ideology. And ideology is not politics, but good politics are not good politics if there is not an ideological perspective behind them. But if ideology is like a good religion, a good faith, a good lie, it's logically tight. But when you set it down in the complexities of life with your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your partner, your children, your church, your workplace, it gets very complex, doesn't it? We know that, but somehow we are pulled towards these abstractions. So go forth and produce governance stewards who are going to work in collaboration with you as citizens. Map the continent of Africa for its most progressive social movements. Be very careful of what governance leaders you select to cooperate with, and pay a lot of attention to the most dynamic region in the world, which is the Caribbean and Latin America. The Center for Reparatory Justice is in the Caribbean. All of those countries are small capitalist countries, but they're doing important democratic work in association with socialist Cuba, in association with President Obrador of Mexico, in association with the democratic socialist who has been elected for the third time in Brazil, Lula da Silva, with the former guerrilla leader Petro and the Vice President Francia Marquez. Francia Marquez is not talking in abstractions about reparations. She was just in Geneva 2 days ago talking about reparations tied to debt. Who else is talking about debt? Mia Motley in Barbados, a very important leader who is challenging the Bretton Woods institutions openly. Now, do you agree with her on X, a Z, a Y? You may or you may not. But this is where we have to look at, where is the red thread? What is the main thread? Not everything is a whole cloth, and we have to figure out which of those various threads, and it takes an active engagement with what people are actually doing, while keeping in mind the utopian ideas that we all should have of how we think the world should look, how theory tells us it should look, but we have to engage it in the complexity that it is. Let me stop there and hope that this has made some contribution to what I think has been an extraordinary group of presentations about what is actually going on and where we need to intersect, and how we need to build these nodes of nodes, these network of networks, in order to make radical transformation and to be who we are in whatever space we inhabit, and not let these spaces define us as the US State Department is doing presently with these young African leaders. And I look around the room of brothers and sisters, and I use that term very liberally, not just based on skin color, who I know are dealing with Africa, who are not here today. And I'm not talking about students who are doing papers. I'm talking about some people who are out here inhabiting the State Department without any critical engagement. And there are young Black people working at that State Department. They often called on me in my work. And for those of you, not just students, but young adults, I guarantee you with that in the next 3 years, someone you've been sitting next to, someone you've been working next to, someone you've been studying with will be working at the US State Department. They are not your enemy. You have to figure out how to engage them to maximize the positionality that they occupy. We have such a tendency to say, if she or he is in this or that organization, life is too complex to make those simple reductions. And when we make those simple reductions, the people who are much more conscious than we, who run the world, say, let's exploit this arena, let's exploit that arena, because they're not looking at the world as it is actually evolving itself. They're looking at idealistic perspectives, not realistic engagement. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ted. And I'm sure you'll still be with us. The audience might have questions and certainly follow up.
I hope they have answers.
Well, let's see. But yes, it's now time to turn the mic to Prof. Horace Campbell, the North America chapter of President, Chair of the North America chapter of the Global Panelists. Prof. Horace.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. I was not going to speak as we are running short of time, and we have to respect those who have assisted us, work with us. And I want to repeat the thanks from the Global Pan-African Movement, North American chapter, to our brothers and sisters from Howard University, especially our sister, Christy Johnson, who is the director of the Center for African Studies, for the time and effort she put in to ensure that as scholars, as activists, as intellectuals, we have a say in what is going on in global Africa. So please give it up for Krista and the brothers and sisters from Howard University who will work with us. And Krista started for us from African Studies, and Brother Ralph from the African American Studies will end for us from Howard University. So what's said here by James about the intellectual traditions of Howard University, the Global Pan-African Movement would like to underline that. Because one of the most important aspects of this summit that's coming up is who will control the discussion and the terms of reference for that discussion. And if you come into Washington, D.C., which is a city where African people live, you have to respect what is happening here. So I want to also thank my brothers and sisters of the Global Pan-African Movement, because they came from very far. People came from Syracuse, from Ohio, from Washington, D.C. Sister Sophia, she drove up from Baltimore this morning, she had another engagement. And I want to say that we want to thank them for this kind of commitment. I want to thank them for this kind of work, because we're trying to build something that's different. I want to also thank all of those who have come on this platform, our brothers from Friends of the Congo and Black Alliance, because I did not think I had to say anything, because most of what I was going to say and most of what I am involved in saying has been said. Our young brother Issa from Libya, I'm sure you want to give him another round of applause. Because I wrote a book on global NATO and the catastrophic failure in Libya, but he is bringing us up to date on the role of the United States and their destruction in Libya. And when the United States used narratives such as providing security for Africa, we do not go along with those words. We talk about destruction, because that's exactly what they have done over the past years. Now, the point for those of you in the university is for you not to follow the language that comes from the United States government, but to inform a new language in terms of what the relationship should be. This year is 50 years since Walter Rodney wrote the book, How Europe Ought to Develop Africa. This book, How Europe Ought to Develop Africa, is very important reference point for the relationship between Africa and global Africa. Walter Rodney said that we had 3 responsibilities. The first responsibility is to define for ourselves what are our objectives. That is, we, wherever we are, should define our objectives. Secondly, we should be able to clarify our goals to other Africans and Black people in other parts of global Africa. What we're trying to do today is to clarify where we stand in relationship to the US government, in relationship to our brothers and sisters in Colombia, in Brazil, and in Haiti, because we cannot speak about the US-Africa Summit without speaking about what they're trying to do in Haiti. So we have to clarify that. And the third objective that Walter Rodney said we should have is we should be able to define our objectives to other sections of the progressive community. That is, the other sections of the anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and those who want peace in the world. And that is why our young brother, Marc Mealy, was able to speak about what is going on in Vietnam. And Vietnam as all those people who fought against the US imperialism, and those who fought to build a new economy. So this panel is on coercive diplomacy. And I want us to underline what was said on the panel on militarism this morning. The only big topic that we have not addressed here, which should have been addressed, is a question of Ethiopia and the question of the war that was going on in Tigray. And we, the Global Pan-African Movement, believe that it's very important that we follow this, that we carry forward the Pan-African position on why we want peace and demilitarization in Tigray and Ethiopia. I will not say much more about that, but I just want to give you a number of examples of the US government doublespeak when Julie Lynn read out those points of what the US government is standing for in its relationship with Africa. I just want to tell you a number of small stories. The first one is about the US Space Administration. A month ago, the people from NASA called together the African Space Research Institute. One of my elders is the director of the African Space Leadership Institute. The United States came to get them and said, well, we are having a moon probe to set up our space capabilities to confront China. And we want Africa to join us in confronting China. The brothers and sisters said, but in Africa, we need space capabilities for telecommunications, for climate monitoring, and for what is happening on the ground in Africa. But for the United States of America, what is happening in Africa is irrelevant, and Africans should subjugate their interest to the interest of the United States and the United States military. That's the first story I want to tell you. The second story I want to tell you is about the United States Africa Command and the United States militarism. The United States signed a deal with Australia and with United Kingdom called the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal. In this deal, the Australians had previously signed a deal with the French government. And the French government was so upset that France broke diplomatic relations with the United States of America to say, you're insulting us. And what did the Biden administration do? They said, okay, in order to make sure you're not so angry, we will support everything you do in your military operations in Africa. So Africa now becomes the platform to support the conservative military forces in France, who works with the conservative military forces in the United States of America. One of the things we want to say is when you talk about AFRICOM and the US Africa Command, which sections of the United States military are you talking about? Those of you who are from Washington, D.C., will know there's a man called General William Walker. General William Walker said that the top generals of the military are absolute liars based on what happened on January the 6th. And this division within the US military between those who are neo-fascist and those who are professional military who want to support the Constitution, we do not support neither faction of the military. But when they go to Africa, we ask them, who are you representing? Are you representing those who want to overthrow the US Constitution? Those people who work with France and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to destabilize Africa. That's the second point I want to make. The third point I want to make is with respect to the United States and its double speak. The United States is saying to Africans, do what we say and don't do what we do. In order for the United States to compete against China, they have passed something called the CHIPS Act, that they're going to spend billions of dollars developing science and technology in the United States of America. The French and the Germans said to the United States of America, this is protectionism. You're going against the WTO. So the same United States government goes to the IMF and say that Africa should not build industries to protect themselves. So the United States is saying, do what we say and don't do what we do. The last point I want to make is bullying of Africans. There's something going on before the United States Congress called Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa. So the Minister of International Relations in South Africa said this is bullying Africa because the United States is asking Africans to choose between China, Russia, and Africa. And as Marc Mealy said, Africans should make a choice for one thing: what is good for Africans? And that is the main question before the African people. I want to stop there because I want to say that We want to bring you in the conversation, especially those online, because the Global Pan-African Movement, we believe that the initiative towards what is going on should be in relationship to what is being good for Africa. Let me mention one of the side meetings that is going to be held in this US-Africa Summit. One of the side meetings that is being held in the US-Africa Summit is being called by the Milliken Institute. Some of you know who Mike Milliken is. Mike Milliken is someone who was put in jail because of stock market fraud 30 years ago. Mike Milliken is having something like the Davos in the United States of America. Now, the session that Milliken is calling is a secret session for particular heads of state, and only heads of state who are involved in illicit outflows of capital from Africa to the United States of America. So the US-Africa Summit is to bring African leaders who are complicit in the illicit flow of capital from Africa to the United States of America. The Global Pan-African Movement, progressive intellectuals, anti-capitalist forces, people who want peace, global solidarity, would want to ensure that we stand for peace, reconstruction, and reparative justice. Global Pan-African Movement, go on our website, we oppose the war in Ukraine. We call for negotiations. We call for peace. But we also recognize that there are provocations, that this war must end. It's a bane for the Ukrainian people and for the Russian people. None of the issues in Ukraine can be resolved by war. And there are four main issues that you as young people should follow. The first issue that we started with this morning with Libya, the Global Pan-African Movement calls for the dismantling of NATO. NATO is a front for Western capital. NATO destroyed Libya. So we agree, NATO should not be expanded. The second question in the war in Ukraine, what is the future of the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass and Luhansk? These are questions that must be negotiated, just as how we negotiated the question of French in Quebec and in Canada. These can be negotiated. The third question, what is the future of Crimea? This must be negotiated. The fourth question, which cannot be negotiated, is what is the future of the fascists in Ukraine, the Bandera forces? Many of you have heard of Adolf Hitler. Very few of you have heard of Stepan Bandera, who was a contemporary of Hitler, and the Bandera forces are the forces that the United States are supporting in Ukraine. 4 years ago, the United States government said, we cannot support the Azov battalion because they are fascists. And now the United States is putting money from the Congress and your hard-earned money to support fascists. So we from the Global Pan-African Movement said, we are not choosing sides in this war in Ukraine. This war must end. The United States should not bully Africans, and the United States strategy for Africa is another backdoor presentation for the United States Africa Command, because the United States have no interest in Africa other than a military interest to dominate and destroy Africa.
Thank you very much, Prof. And there's so much coming. I'm sure you have your thoughts and you will have questions, and we're hoping that we'll have much time for questions and answers. I just wanted to reiterate one point that Prof made, and which our guest online made earlier, which has to do with that from the Cold War, even prior to that date, a lot of the time, African position has been non-aligned. It doesn't matter whether you're Russia or you're America. We should not be pressured to back any side. And African had been a strong part of the non-aligned movement. Of course, with time we've seen this breaking away because of, but I guess the position again, which is clearly being made, is no one has to pressure any African country to support the IE. We want an African or Pan-African. And today we are talking of African countries of 55, according to the African Union currently, including the Saharan Republic, which broke away from Morocco. So we are talking of 55 countries, and they should not be couched into supporting, no matter what the strength, whether economic sanctions or whatever. No one has had to pressure, or no one should pressure any country to back their interests, whether US, China, or Russia. So, Prof, thank you very much for clearly spelling those points out. We're going to take a last speaker, and then we'll open the floor for conversation. Our other guests couldn't join us from Sudan.
No.
But a good point,
They'll join us in the next panel, so
Yeah.
we switched our speakers. Yeah.
yes, but exactly. So he couldn't join this session. But in his stead, we are glad we have a video recording from the spokesperson of the Sudanese Professional Association. They have also been very vocal on the ground, championing citizenry approach to governance, alternative to what the West is basically trying to impose on Sudan. So we are glad that Waleed who joined us in this video recording. Shall we listen to it?
Dear colleagues, comrades, brothers and sisters. My name is Waleed Ibrahim, spokesman of Sudanese Professional Association. KA, the Association of Different Sudanese Institutional Trade Unions. The association started forming 2012 as an extension for the Professional Union, which has significant role by identify the coup in 1989. The trade union was dissolved. All its leaders became designated or had to be that PA has a significant contribution
We thank Waleed Ibrahim for the message. Now we have 15 minutes. We'll try to run up within 13, 14, so we conclude. The floor is open. For those who have joined us on Zoom as well, you are a part of us. If you can, please, you lift your hand and you will be spotlighted, and then you can have your conversation. I think we'll have our first outcome.
It's okay. Really, it's really just an announcement.
Yes.
That even though we may have had poor sound quality here, all the videos will be online and you'll be able to hear them come.
Thank you very much. Yes, including the special messages that were delivered by video. But for the first video we heard from a female guest, there is a second part which got truncated. All of them will be available and will be sent to those who have signed up for today's session. So the floor is open now. Questions, and please reach out to any of the participants. I believe we still have Mr. Mealy with us as well. If you have any question related to the lessons from the ASEAN region and how they've approached how Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the rest that we've heard from, in addition to our two panelists here, feel free to address the question to any of them.
Thank you. Real quickly, James, I'm glad you brought up this issue of engaging in the electoral arena. It is elected. I was wondering if you could also give maybe the role of our people organizing around being not just individually going and pulling a lever, but also neglect like ballot initiative, referendums, and even nominations of.
I will do that, but let me suggest that in order to maximize audience participation, either your comments or your questions, that maybe we take a block of 3 or 4, and then I will address that.
Yeah. And if they can come to the front, easier to hear us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we can take 2 more questions if you have, and then we take response. Okay. Please go.
Yeah, I have a question.
yes.
Thank you for all the panelists for a very clear panel. My question is more so to kind of put to bed or to start thinking about this new imperialism of China in Africa. I think some of our panelists might be equipped to speak to us about why that is largely like a propaganda tool that's happening and kind of set the record straight about what kind of trade is generally beneficial for Africans and why this new China imperialist power is really a framing by the global West, and kind of speak more on that. Thank you.
Before I come to Netra, I'll sort of toot my own YouTube. I would urge you to go on YouTube and look for New World Coming, James Early, with Michaela Escar, talking about working class Pan-Africanism. And she takes up this question of China versus the West. With regard to the electoral arena, we are living in a society where the elite dominate in a 2-party system. The question of bourgeois democracy, or democracy within the context of neoliberal capitalism, means that specific sectors are exploited and excluded, and they struggle in 1 or 2 major ways to either become an equal part of that system, or they struggle to overturn it or transform it eventually. We are witnessing a major integration in that system, which is a democratic push to be the first Black woman, the first indigenous man, the first LGBT transportation director, etc. Those are democratic aspirations based on historical marginalization. And so that there is a thread of ethics and truth that we support with the general access of people who are prepared, but we do not support the project that they are to do. This is where This is where the political education has to come in. So Clyburn, who is now staying in the Democratic Party as the fourth person, no longer the third person, the octogenarian. This is a very sophisticated move, with Biden simultaneously saying we will move the primaries to North Carolina, where he was able to disrupt the motion of the Democratic Socialists, not just the individual Bernie Sanders, remembering that Bernie Sanders says this is not about who you elect, it's about you and how you hold that person accountable. Bernie Sanders did not create that motion of trade unionists, nurses, working family party, et cetera, existed pre-Bernie Sanders. He intersected them. This is not an advertisement for Bernie Sanders, but it is to suggest that the rise of democratic socialism, over 40% of young adults, many of you out there, identify with some sense of socialism. This is empirical data that we now have to turn into identifying and grooming stewards of governance to carry on the contradictions within the Democratic Party to the point that it is dismantled. Just as we have seen the destruction of the Republican Party, but we've got all of these liberals who are arguing, where is John McCain? You know, why can't we have the old duopoly of the competition between these two elites who serve the same project, but with just different ends? That's actually what's going on in society. So that the Working Families Party is one that I know very little about. I'm impressed with this young man, Mitchell, and his articulation, not about what he's about, but what that party is about, because they understand that the Republican Party is not our friend and that they have a tactical alliance with those who are in battle within the Democratic Party. You always have to examine what is the correlation of contending forces. And while your viewpoint might be, and I suggest it should be, beyond those contending forces, what is to be done starts with engaging what is being done. So that's what I think we have to do, is we have to identify stewards of governance with great ethics that collaborate with us, and we have to demand that collaboration and get out of this sort of scenario where we wait every 2 to 4 years to see who won or who lost. We, the demos, you know what that term means? The demos, ordinary citizens, that's what the term demos means. Quasha, power, the power of ordinary citizens. And how do we express that in an organized form and situate ourselves in the global governance that we are connected to, whether we understand it or not? I'll start by saying Biden, this has yesterday, or will this today, invite African countries to join the G20. And this is something that the average citizen, black, white, green, polka dot, LGBTQ in the United States, does not have a clue about what is going on. And it is our responsibility, the applied intellectuals, the applied analysts and academics, the left-wing organizing parties, it is our political education responsibility to bring this information to the average organized citizens and her and his organizational group, and to say, this is being done in your name. This is the stake that you have in this situation. So that's why I say that the electoral battlefront, it is not the most important. The most important are citizens' organizations, but it is one that we cannot forsake because it is where governance is designed and executed.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, sir. And we will take, Mr. McMillan, can you attempt addressing briefly the second question from Andy on China and Africa and this so-called Chinese imperialist agenda on the continent?
Sure, thank you, brother. I would offer two points on that front. First and foremost, there's a lot of, how shall we say, demonization and mythology going on in terms of how in the West, the painting of the picture that somehow China is the, quote unquote, imperialist or colonizing force on the continent today. which is always very interesting when quote unquote colonizers are the one throwing the label around. Secondly, I would make the point that, and this is one factual point, the only reason why, in terms of official development assistance, for example, that China has even become a player in that game is because we know after decades and decades of official development assistance coming from the West via IMF, World Bank structural adjustment programs, many developing countries began to say, wow, we need some alternatives. And China positioned itself as one of the kinds of alternatives. And therefore it became now, fast forward today, is a much bigger player, still small relative to the Paris Club and debt that the World Bank and IMF and other donors still have out there, so to speak. But as we see from the narrative, all this focus now on like China is putting countries into debt. China is the one that's basically stealing countries' ports or whatever because they can't pay those debts, so to speak. But the point, a third point I would make in this question is, and I think we raised it a bit earlier, on many of these kinds of international economic kinds of dynamics, China is really not, again, an intellectual visionary leader in terms of really putting forth progressive alternatives. They may put forth some alternatives, but we may critique the real progressiveness or lack thereof nature of it. And I say that point to say that, again, in relative terms for, for a country like Angola to say, okay, we won't borrow from the IMF or World Bank, but we'll take money from China, and then China links that assistance to maybe accessing Angolan oil. Those relationships, which again, relatively new or different from the historical ones, from my point of view, in some ways do sort of repeat or perpetuate sort of the same old types of dynamics. They don't really represent something as something really that's truly progressive as an alternative. And again, we all probably would agree. Have the quote unquote governments on the continent, have they demanded that when they went to the alternative, that the quote unquote China provided a real alternative? Or they just say, hey man, we'll take the same old thing, just take it from you now. And because you guys will ask for fewer quote unquote conditionalities. And the Chinese, again, not necessarily being truly visionary intellect. Oh, well, if they'll accept the same old thing, we'll just pretty much copycat, what the bank and the fund have been doing. Maybe we'll package it different ways, those kinds of things. So I think, again, demonization is being done on purpose, but at the same time, in some ways, these examples of alternatives between China and Africa, we can find some exceptions, building new, buildings for the AU and those kinds of things, maybe doing some more road construction that don't just simply move resources from a mine to a port, bypassing this actual society, so to speak. There are exceptions to those things. And I think it's always relevant to highlight those examples of where a Chinese investor is actually doing something to the benefit of the society where they're investing in. But broadly speaking, I think in a lot more propaganda than real nuanced critique and analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Mealy. And I'll give Prof a chance. And Prof, I will tie that in with an exception that the organizers of this event raised with a US, I guess, 2022 strategy, with a sub-Saharan Africa strategy. I will tie that in so you could perhaps conclude on that since we are short of time.
Okay, thank you. I think everybody's made the point that this sub-Saharan Africa is an insult to Africa, because the idea of sub-Saharan Africa is racist, because it comes from the Pentagon's view that North Africa is part of the Arab world, and what happened in Egypt could not have come from Africans. So we have a policy for North Africa, which is different from Africa. So the policy itself is racist. And we in the Global Pan-African Movement do not use the formulation sub-Saharan Africa. So the US policy towards Africa is racist in principle and in reality, and its intellectual foundation, because no progressive African scholar will use the question of sub-Saharan Africa. I think the points that have been covered by James and by Marc are well taken. I want to just underline what Brother Waleed has said from Sudan. It's been 3 years since the Sudanese revolution has removed the military. In the 3 years that the Sudanese revolutionary removed the military, and Waleed is a spokesperson for the Sudanese Professional Association. In the 3 years, they've been having demonstrations every day to remove the military. But who is it that is keeping the militaries in power? United States, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So here's a case where the African people in the Sudan are fighting for freedom from Islamicists, militarists, and the United States of America is aligned with Russia, with those militaries, and with the people in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. That is why we have to define for ourselves what's going on in global Africa. Global Pan-African movement stands in solidarity with the revolution in the Sudan. The revolution in the Sudan is at the forefront of the African revolution today. And we cannot have a session on the United States relations with Africa without condemning the United States military support for Saudi Arabia and for United Arab Emirates in Yemen and what they are doing in Yemen. That's what I want to say.
And a big round of applause to our guests today. Yes, and we are 2 minutes behind time, so I want to say a big thank you to all for this session. And big thanks to Mr. Mealy, to our two panelists here, Mr. James Mealy and Prof. Campbell, for this opportunity. And a big thanks to you, our guests. Another big round of applause to you and to all those who are joining us. Thank you, and I'll hand it back to Mariam and the team. I guess we'll take a couple minutes break, or we just go right into the next session.
3 minutes break.
3 minutes break. If you can use the bathroom quickly, and then we come for our next session. Thank you.
Okay.